My parents left me at a train station as a joke. Let us see how she finds her way home. My father laughed as they drove away. I was 15 years old, standing alone with no money, no phone, and no family. I never went back. 18 years later, they found me. This morning, I woke up to 99 missed calls and a demand for $500,000. What they did not know was that the terrified teenager they abandoned was gone. In her place was the CEO of a private equity firm, and I was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. My name is Hannah, and at 33 years old, I have built an empire from absolutely nothing. The morning it all began started like any other Tuesday in my Manhattan penthouse. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a pale golden light across the hardwood floors of my bedroom. I had always been an early riser, a habit born out of necessity during the years I spent clawing my way through college and building my boutique private equity firm, Apex Holdings. My husband Ryan was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and steady. We had been married for 5 years, and he was the only true family I had ever known. I reached over to silence the soft alarm on my nightstand, but before my fingers could even graze the screen, the device began vibrating aggressively against the polished wood. It was not the gentle hum of a morning alarm. It was the frantic, continuous buzzing of a phone receiving a relentless barrage of notifications. I picked it up, expecting to see an urgent email from my lead financial analyst or a message from a European client in a different time zone. Instead, the screen displayed a staggering 99 missed calls. Below the missed calls was a wall of text messages from several unknown numbers. I unlocked the phone, my brow furrowing in confusion. The messages were coming in faster than I could read them, all typed with a frantic, demanding energy. I opened the most recent text, and the blood instantly froze in my veins. The message was from a number I did not have saved, but I recognized the tone immediately. It was from Linda, my mother, the woman I had not spoken to or even seen in 18 years. The message read, "We saw the Forbes article. We know you run Apex. Brittany's lifestyle brand is failing and the bank is foreclosing on our house. Transfer $500,000 by noon. You owe us for giving you life. Do not be selfish." I stared at the glowing screen, the words burning themselves into my mind. There was no greeting. There was no hello, no asking how I had been for the last 2 decades. There was certainly no apology for leaving a vulnerable teenager alone at a massive transit hub to fend for herself. There was only a blunt, entitled demand for $500,000. They had seen the recent feature in Forbes magazine profiling my firm's success. The article had included a full-page photograph of me standing in my corporate boardroom. They had seen my face, realized I was wealthy, and immediately reached out with their hands open. For a moment, the silence of the bedroom was deafening. If this had happened 10 years ago, I might have panicked. I might have cried, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of the people who had caused me so much pain. But at 33, as the founder of a highly successful financial institution, I felt no panic. I felt no fear. I felt an absolute calculating calm wash over me. The audacity of their demand was almost impressive. My sister Brittany had always been the golden child, the one who received designer clothes and luxury vacations, while I was told to find a job if I wanted school supplies. And now her supposed lifestyle brand was failing, and they expected the daughter they discarded to bail them out. I did not reply to the text. Engaging emotionally was exactly what toxic people wanted. It gave them a foothold. Instead, I took a screenshot of the message along with the log of the 99 missed calls. I opened my email and drafted a brief, sterile message to my corporate legal team. I attached the screenshots and typed a simple instruction. Prep a harassment injunction against these numbers. Do not engage. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the nightstand, and quietly slipped out of bed. The marble floor of the master bathroom was cold beneath my feet, grounding me in the present moment. I went through my morning routine with mechanical precision. I turned on the shower, letting the hot water wash away the lingering tension in my shoulders. As I stood under the spray, I thought about the sheer entitlement radiating from my mother's message. You owe us for giving you life. The phrase echoed in my head, absurd and hollow. They had given me life, yes, but they had also done their best to destroy it. I had survived in spite of them, not because of them. When I walked back into the bedroom wrapped in a towel, Ryan was sitting up in bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He noticed my rigid posture immediately. "You have your war face on," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "What happened? Did the London deal fall through?" I walked into my expansive walk-in closet, pulling out a tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect. "The London deal is fine," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "Just some spam messages, nothing I cannot handle." Ryan knew everything about my past. He knew the horrors of my adolescence and the deep scars left by my family's abandonment. But I did not want to burden him with this yet. I wanted to assess the threat level before bringing the chaos into our home. I brushed it off, projecting the same unbothered authority I used in the boardroom. I finished dressing, slipped on my heels, and clasped my favorite watch around my wrist. It was a vintage piece I had bought for myself after closing my first major acquisition, a daily reminder of my own capabilities. I kissed Ryan goodbye, told him I loved him, and headed down to the private garage where my chauffeur Thomas was waiting. The drive to the Apex Holdings headquarters usually took 20 minutes. I sat in the back of the sleek black car, watching the city wake up through the tinted windows. New York was a city of survivors, a place where people came to reinvent themselves. I had built my fortress here, floor by floor, deal by deal. My firm was respected, my life was secure, and I was not going to let the ghosts of my past tear down the walls I had painstakingly erected. As Thomas navigated through the morning traffic, my phone remained silent. The legal team must have already initiated the blocking protocols. I opened my tablet and began reviewing the financial reports for the upcoming board meeting, forcing my mind to focus on numbers, margins, and projections. Logic was my safe haven. Numbers did not lie, and they certainly did not demand things they had not earned. The car pulled up to the curb outside my high-rise office building in the financial district. The towering glass structure reflected the morning sun, a monument to corporate power. Thomas opened the door for me and I stepped out onto the pavement, adjusting my blazer. I took a deep breath of the crisp city air, feeling completely in control. Just as I reached for the brass handle of the main entrance doors, my phone began to ring. It was not a blocked number. The caller identification displayed the name of the building's head of security, a retired police officer named David, who handled all access control for the corporate suites. I answered the call, expecting a routine question about a vendor delivery. "Good morning, David," I said, pushing through the heavy glass doors into the expansive sunlit lobby. "Is there an issue with the catering for the board meeting, Miss Hannah?" David said, his usually calm voice laced with urgency. "I apologize for disturbing you, but we have a situation downstairs at the concierge desk. There are 3 individuals causing a significant disturbance. They are demanding access to your private elevator bank." I paused in the middle of the lobby, my eyes scanning the massive marble space. What kind of disturbance, I asked, though a cold dread was already beginning to form in my stomach. "They are screaming at the staff," David explained. "They are holding up copies of a magazine and telling everyone in the lobby that they are your family. They say they are not leaving until they see the ungrateful runaway." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I did not let it show. I stood perfectly still in the center of my corporate kingdom, realizing that the message I had received an hour ago was not just a demand. It was a warning. My family had not just found my phone number, they had found my sanctuary, and they had brought their toxicity straight to my front door. "Understood, David," I replied, my voice dropping to a low commanding register. "Do not let them pass the security turnstiles. I am coming down now." I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. 18 years ago, they had left me completely powerless. But today, they had walked into my territory, and I was about to show them exactly what kind of woman that abandoned teenager had become. The steel doors of my private elevator slid open, revealing the sprawling expanse of the Apex Holdings lobby. Usually the only sounds echoing across the imported marble were the quiet hum of negotiations and the steady click of designer heels. Today, the pristine atmosphere was shattered by frantic shouting. I stepped out of the elevator car and locked eyes with the source of the chaos. Standing aggressively at the security desk were three figures who looked violently out of place in my world. Linda, David, and Brittany. My mother, my father, and my older sister. 18 years had aged them, but the entitled energy radiating from their tight formation was exactly as I remembered. Linda was wearing an oversized trench coat, clutching a rolled-up copy of Forbes magazine like a weapon. David stood beside her, jabbing his thick finger into the air toward the head of security. Brittany, the undisputed golden child, was pacing back and forth in an outfit that belonged to her failing lifestyle company, her high heels clicking with sharp precision. They were shouting over each other, drawing the bewildered stares of arriving financial analysts, junior partners, and clients waiting near the coffee lounge. David, my head of security, was holding a firm line, his hands raised in a calming gesture that was entirely ignored. I took my time walking across the expansive lobby floor, letting the rhythmic sound of my footsteps announce my arrival. I wanted them to see me in my element, surrounded by the empire I had built, while they firmly believed I was rotting away somewhere in the gutters of the city. When Brittany finally spotted me, her pacing stopped abruptly. She did not smile. There was no relief in her eyes at seeing the younger sister she had not spoken to since we were teenagers. There was only a flash of raw, unfiltered greed, quickly masked by a condescending sneer. Linda turned, following Brittany's gaze, and her mouth dropped open slightly. She looked me up and down, taking in the tailored charcoal suit, the vintage watch, and the unmistakable aura of absolute authority that I wore like armor. David stopped mid-shout, his face flushing a deep, angry red as he glared at me. None of them moved to offer a hug. None of them shed a single tear of joyful reunion or offered a word of regret for the past 2 decades. They simply stared at me like a winning lottery ticket they were violently impatient to cash. Before I could even say a word, Brittany marched forward. She crossed the lobby floor with heavy, aggressive strides, completely ignoring the security guards who stepped forward to intercept her path. I held up a single hand, signaling David and his security team to stand down. I wanted to see exactly how far my sister was willing to go in public. Brittany stopped just inches from me, invading my personal space with the exact same bullying tactics she had perfected when we were children. She shoved a thick, professionally bound legal document directly into my chest. "Read it and sign it," she demanded, her voice loud enough to echo toward the espresso bar, where my employees were actively gathering to watch the spectacle. I did not raise my hands to take the heavy stack of paper. I simply let it slide off my silk lapel and hit the marble floor with a resounding thud. The loose pages spilled across the polished stone. "What is this?" I asked, my voice deadly calm and barely above a whisper. Brittany glared down at the fallen document, and then back up at me, her eyes narrowing with absolute entitlement. "It is a family support contract," she stated, crossing her arms over her chest. "Our lawyers drew it up yesterday as soon as we saw your magazine cover. It legally guarantees us 20% equity in your company, plus a monthly stipend to compensate for elder care and familial distress. You owe us for the severe emotional toll your selfish disappearance took on this family." I looked at the pages scattered across the floor, feeling a profound sense of disgust wash over me. They had not come to apologize or make amends. They had brought a predatory lawyer's extortion attempt, dressed up as a heartfelt family reunion. Linda suddenly pushed past Brittany, adopting a loud, theatrical tone, clearly meant for the growing audience in the lobby. "You abandoned us," she cried out, placing a dramatic, trembling hand over her heart. "We gave you everything, we loved you, and you ran away to hoard your wealth, while your own father and I are facing foreclosure. You are a terrible, selfish daughter. Look at you standing here in your glass tower, while the family who raised you is suffering." I looked around the lobby, observing the reactions of the people around us. Junior associates were awkwardly pretending to check their phones while important clients exchanged uncomfortable whispers. Linda was banking on the idea that a high-profile chief executive officer would do absolutely anything to avoid a public scandal. She was relying on the old social contract that dictated family matters should be handled quietly and respectfully, assuming I would quickly hand over the money just to make them disappear and save face. She had severely miscalculated the woman standing in front of her. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not lower my head in shame or panic at the unwanted attention. I maintained absolute, unwavering composure. "You did not raise me, Linda," I said, making sure my voice carried with crisp, clear articulation to the very back of the lobby. "You housed me until I was 15, and then you discarded me the moment I became an inconvenience to your luxury vacation plans. You have no legal, moral, or financial claim to a single dime of my money." The coldness in my response seemed to physically jolt my father. He took a threatening step forward, raising his fist, but the security team immediately closed the distance, forming a solid wall between him and me. "You ungrateful brat," my father spat, his face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "We gave you life. Everything you have is because of us. We will drag your name through the mud. We will tell everyone what a monster you really are." I looked at the head of security, giving him a decisive nod. "Escort them out, David," I commanded without breaking eye contact with my father. "And if they step foot on this property again, have them arrested for trespassing." As the security guards firmly took my parents by the arms and began guiding them toward the revolving doors, Brittany refused to move. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She quickly hit the record button on the screen, pointing the camera lens directly at my face. Her polite, victimized facade completely vanished, replaced by a dark, malicious glare that revealed her true nature. She stepped in uncomfortably close, lowering her voice so only I could hear the venom dripping from her words. "You have exactly 24 hours to sign that contract," she whispered, a cruel, calculating smile curling the edges of her lips. "If the money is not in our accounts by tomorrow morning, I am going straight to the media. I will expose you to the entire world as a mentally unstable runaway teenager who broke her loving parents' hearts. Let us see what happens to your precious corporate empire when everyone knows exactly what kind of sociopath is running it." I stared directly into the little black lens of her phone. I did not shrink away. I did not attempt to cover my face or bat the device out of her hand. Instead, I took a deliberate, measured step forward. The sudden proximity caught Brittany off guard, forcing her to stumble back a half step in her designer heels to keep me in the frame. I kept my gaze locked on the camera, ensuring my voice was carrying loud and clear over the quiet murmur of the stunned lobby. "By all means, Brittany, keep recording," I said, my tone as sharp as cracked ice. "Make sure you get the lighting just right. I want everyone to see the faces of the people who walked into my building this morning to extort me. I want the world to see the forged contract you just threw on my floor, demanding 20% of a company you had absolutely no part in building." My father's face contorted with a furious, ugly pride at my defiance. He stepped around my mother, his chest puffed out as he pointed a thick, trembling finger at my face. "We made you the millionaire you are," he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high glass ceilings. "If we had not left you at Penn Station when you were 15 to teach you a lesson about independence, you would be nothing. You would still be a pathetic, needy little girl. We gave you the push you needed to succeed, and this is how you repay us." I turned my attention from the camera lens to my father's sweating face. "A lesson about independence," I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of his words hang in the air. I looked back at the phone Brittany was holding like a weapon. "Let us make sure your audience gets the full context of that glorious parenting lesson, Brittany. Do not cut away now." I raised my voice, addressing not just my so-called family, but the dozens of employees, executives, and clients frozen in the lobby. 18 years ago, I was a 15-year-old girl who made the terrible mistake of asking for $50 to buy high school art supplies. That was my crime. That was the unbearable financial burden I placed upon you. The lobby went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic outside. I took another step toward them, feeling the ghost of that terrified teenager standing right beside me, lending me her righteous anger. I remembered that car ride perfectly. I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. You told me we were going into the city for a special family dinner to celebrate my good grades. I remembered my mother asking to see my flip phone to check the time, casually slipping it into her purse. I remembered you asking me to run into the terminal to grab a train schedule, telling me to leave my small wallet in the glove compartment for safekeeping. I remembered stepping onto the crowded, dirty floor of Penn Station, turning around to find the curb completely empty. I remembered watching the taillights of your car disappear into the Manhattan traffic, leaving me completely alone, with nothing but the clothes on my back. And why did you do it? I asked, stepping closer to David, refusing to let him look away. Because you thought it was a hilarious joke. You wanted to take Brittany on a 2-week luxury cruise to the Bahamas, and you did not want to pay for a second teenager. You literally discarded your youngest child at a transit hub like a piece of unwanted luggage so you could sip champagne on a deck chair without feeling financially constrained. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The theatrical victim routine had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine panic as she realized everyone in the room was listening to the truth. You did not teach me about independence, I stated, my voice unwavering. You taught me about survival. You left a minor to freeze in a city she did not know. If it had not been for a transit police officer who found me shivering near the ticketing booths at 2 a.m, I could have ended up dead or worse. I spent the next 3 years bouncing between a youth shelter and the foster care system. I worked 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford community college while you were busy buying Brittany her first sports car. I built my empire with my own 2 hands, with my own blood and sweat, while you pretended I did not exist. Brittany's hand began to tremble. The malicious smirk had completely melted off her face, replaced by a pale, sickly realization. She looked down at the phone in her hand, the red recording dot still blinking steadily on the screen. She had intended to capture a video of a heartless chief executive officer abusing her poor, destitute parents. Instead, she had just recorded her father loudly and proudly confessing to child abandonment, extortion, and endangerment in front of dozens of credible witnesses. She frantically tapped the screen, trying to stop the recording and delete the file, but her hands were shaking too violently to hit the right buttons. The weapon she had brought to destroy me had just exploded in her own hands. Just as Brittany fumbled with her device, the polished steel doors of the executive elevator slid open behind me. Ryan stepped out, his tall frame instantly commanding the space. He had seen the security feed from our penthouse and had come straight down to the lobby. He was flanked by 4 more of our private security personnel men who moved with quiet, intimidating purpose. Ryan took one look at the scattered contract on the floor, the trembling smartphone in Brittany's hand, and the furious faces of my parents, and he immediately moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. His presence was a solid, comforting anchor in the center of the storm. I am perfectly fine, I murmured to Ryan without breaking eye contact with my family. David, get this trash out of my lobby. Do whatever is necessary. The security team moved with swift, uncompromising efficiency. 2 guards flanked my mother, ignoring her shrill, desperate protests as they gripped her upper arms and steered her toward the exit. Another guard easily stepped into Brittany's path, blocking her camera and ushering her backward. My sister stumbled in her expensive heels, her bravado completely shattered as the reality of her spectacular miscalculation set in. She looked panicked, realizing that the video evidence of their extortion attempt was now permanently saved on her device, a digital confession of their own making. But my father was not going to go quietly. As the 2 largest guards seized him by the shoulders, he began to thrash and kick, his face turning an alarming, vibrant shade of purple. He dug the rubber soles of his shoes into the marble floor, fighting the inevitable momentum as he was forcefully dragged backward toward the heavy revolving doors. His pride was wounded, and his sense of entitlement was blinding him to the sheer embarrassment of the public spectacle he was creating. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat!" he screamed, saliva flying from his lips as he struggled against the guards. "You think you have won? You think you can just throw us out of here? We already filed a lawsuit against you this morning for elder financial abandonment. We are going to drain every account you have. See you in court, drop out." The heavy revolving doors finally stopped spinning, leaving the lobby in a breathless, ringing silence. I stood perfectly still, watching the sidewalk outside through the floor-to-ceiling glass, as my father ripped his arm away from the security guard, spat on the pavement, and stormed off down the avenue with my mother and sister hurrying to keep up. Ryan placed a warm, grounding hand on the small of my back. I leaned into his touch for just a fraction of a second, absorbing his silent support, before turning back to face my employees. They were all standing frozen by the espresso bar and the reception desks, their eyes wide with shock. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket, offered a polite, reassuring smile to the room, and calmly told everyone to have a productive morning. Then I walked into my private elevator with Ryan and went to work. I knew my sister well enough to know that her threat was not an empty one, but I also knew that reacting prematurely would only give her the power she so desperately craved. I spent the remainder of the day in back-to-back meetings, finalizing a corporate merger, and projecting an aura of absolute normalcy, waiting for the inevitable axe to fall. It fell at exactly 6 in the morning, the very next day. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee when Ryan walked in, his face pale and his jaw set in a tight, angry line. He did not say good morning. He simply walked over, placed his tablet on the marble counter in front of me, and pressed play. Brittany had made good on her threat, but she had done it with a level of calculated malice that even I had underestimated. She had spent the night heavily editing the footage from the lobby. The video playing on the screen did not show her aggressive march across the floor. It did not show her shoving the predatory contract into my chest, and it certainly did not show my father proudly admitting that they had abandoned me at a train station when I was 15 years old. All of that context had been surgically removed. Instead, the video started right at the moment I signaled security. It showed two large men physically grabbing my weeping mother and dragging my father away while I stood there in a tailored suit, looking cold and completely unbothered. Over this highly manipulated footage, Brittany had recorded a tearful, trembling voiceover. She introduced herself to the internet and told a heartbreaking, entirely fabricated story about how her aging parents were on the verge of being thrown out onto the street. She painted a picture of a loving family who had exhausted their life savings trying to help a mentally unstable runaway teenager, only to be violently cast aside when that teenager stumbled into billions. She called me a corporate monster. She called me a sociopath who hoarded obscene wealth while leaving the people who gave her life to face imminent eviction and absolute destitution. Beneath the viral video was a link to a crowdfunding campaign. The page featured a tragic photo of David and Linda looking exhausted and frail, begging the public for $500,000 to save their childhood home from a cruel banking foreclosure. The internet, always hungry for a wealthy villain, had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. The video already had millions of views. The comment section was a horrifying river of pure hatred, directed squarely at me, calling for my company to be boycotted, my assets to be seized, and my reputation to be destroyed. Ryan reached out to pause the video, his hands shaking with protective rage. He asked me if I wanted him to call our lawyers to issue a massive defamation lawsuit before the morning news cycles picked up the story. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the bitter liquid coat my throat. I told him no. I told him to let them have their moment in the sun. By the time my car pulled up to the Apex Holdings building 2 hours later, the ripple effect of the viral smear campaign had already hit the corporate level. The lobby was swarming with local news crews and aggressive paparazzi, forcing Thomas to drive me around to the secure underground loading dock just so I could enter my own building safely. The atmosphere on the executive floor was thick with absolute panic. Telephones were ringing incessantly. My public relations director was sweating through his shirt, frantically drafting defensive press releases that I had no intention of approving. Before I could even reach my office door, my assistant informed me that the board of directors had called an emergency mandatory meeting in the main conference room. They were demanding my presence immediately. I walked into the massive mahogany boardroom to find 12 of my top investors and senior partners sitting around the table, their faces grim and deeply concerned. The chairman, an older, deeply conservative man named Arthur, did not waste any time with pleasantries. He pointed to the television screen on the wall, which was currently muted, but displaying Brittany's tearful face on a major morning news broadcast. Arthur bluntly stated that the optics of the situation were catastrophic for the firm. Apex Holdings relied on a reputation of integrity and trust, and having their chief executive officer publicly branded as an elder abuser was causing immediate anxiety among their most lucrative international clients. The board had already drafted a solution, and Arthur slid a printed proposal across the polished wood table toward me. They wanted me to issue a formal public apology to my family, citing a tragic misunderstanding. More importantly, they wanted me to quietly transfer the $500,000 my parents were demanding, framing it as a generous philanthropic family settlement to make the entire scandal disappear before the stock markets opened. "It is a drop in the bucket for you, Hannah," Arthur said, his tone heavy with practical condescension. "Pay them the money, issue the statement, and let us get back to business. You cannot fight a public relations war against a weeping mother and a sister claiming poverty. The public will always side with the perceived victim." I looked down at the printed proposal, my hands resting calmly on the table. I understood their panic. From a purely sterile corporate perspective, paying the extortion fee was the quickest way to stop the bleeding. But they did not understand the psychology of the people they were dealing with. I looked up, meeting the eyes of every single powerful executive in that room, and I adamantly refused. I told them I would not sign the settlement, I would not transfer a single dollar, and I would absolutely not issue an apology for protecting myself from abusers. Arthur sighed heavily, warning me that my stubbornness was going to tank our quarterly projections. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and explained the reality of the situation with clinical precision. I told them that paying off a toxic, narcissistic extortionist does not buy silence. It only validates their tactics and sets a permanent precedent. If I gave them $500,000 today, they would be back in 6 months threatening another viral video for $2 million. I had spent a lifetime serving as my family's designated scapegoat, absorbing their cruelty so they could feel superior. I knew their playbook inside and out. Instead of a defensive statement or a retaliatory counter video, I issued a direct order to my entire public relations and legal team to maintain total, absolute radio silence. No comments to the press, no threatening cease and desist letters, no social media posts, nothing. I explained to the board that toxic people who are handed a false sense of security will always become arrogant, and arrogant people inevitably hang themselves if you just give them enough rope. I demanded they trust the leadership that had made them all incredibly wealthy over the last 5 years. The room was tense, but the sheer force of my conviction eventually silenced their protests. They reluctantly agreed to follow my lead and give my silence strategy a chance to play out. The meeting adjourned, leaving a heavy, nervous energy in the air. I walked back down the quiet, carpeted hallway to my private office, feeling the immense weight of the gamble I had just taken. I knew I was right, but the pressure of being universally hated by millions of strangers online was a heavy burden to carry. I sat down at my desk, rubbing my temples, preparing to dive into the day's legitimate work, to distract myself from the media circus raging outside my windows. Just as I opened my laptop, there was a sharp, urgent knock on my door. My lead financial analyst, a brilliant and meticulous man named Marcus, stepped into the office. He did not look panicked like the public relations team. He looked completely shell-shocked, holding a thick red tabbed corporate dossier in his hands. He closed the door securely behind him, ensuring we were completely alone. Without saying a word, Marcus walked across the room and slid the heavy dossier directly across my glass desk. He took a deep breath and told me that the anonymous high-risk mezzanine loan application we had been waiting for had just officially hit our underwriting department. He urged me to look at the name of the desperate failing company begging for a bailout to avoid immediate bankruptcy. I opened the heavy cover of the dossier, my eyes scanning the top line of the application. The company begging for millions in shadow funding was Lux and Company. It was Brittany's lifestyle brand. She had just unknowingly submitted her entire financial life, her hidden debts, and her desperate need for cash directly to the sister she was currently trying to destroy. I stared at the thick red folder resting on the pristine glass surface of my desk. The corporate logo for Lux and Company was embossed on the cover in a garish metallic gold foil that perfectly encapsulated my sister's entirely superficial aesthetic. Marcus stood silently near the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he waited for my reaction. He knew the history of the viral video. Everyone in the building knew. What he did not know was the sheer breathtaking magnitude of the poetic justice sitting right in front of me. I opened the heavy cover and began to read the executive summary. Brittany was applying for an $8 million mezzanine loan through a firm called Meridian Financial Partners. It was a silent third-party private equity group known for issuing high-risk corporate bailouts to distressed lifestyle brands. What my sister and her overpriced legal team had completely failed to realize was that Meridian Financial Partners was a shadow subsidiary. It was a firm 100% owned, operated, and controlled by Apex Holdings. She was begging for a financial lifeline from the exact same corporate entity she was currently attempting to destroy on social media. I leafed through the preliminary balance sheets Marcus had compiled, and a cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. The numbers told a story of absolute, unmitigated disaster. Lux and Company was not just failing. It was actively hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate. Brittany had structured the company to fund an impossibly lavish lifestyle draining capital, to pay for leased luxury vehicles, exorbitant commercial rent in a high-end shopping district, and relentless personal spending disguised as corporate marketing expenses. According to the notes in the margin, she had a line of angry vendors threatening immediate litigation for unpaid invoices stretching back over a year. She was completely out of options, out of credit, and utterly desperate. She was relying on this specific shadow loan to keep her house of cards from collapsing and to silence the creditors who were closing in on her. I looked up at Marcus, who was watching me with a mixture of professional curiosity and apprehension. He asked if I wanted him to reject the application outright, citing the obvious conflict of interest and the disastrous public relations campaign she had just launched against me. I shook my head slowly, closing the red folder and resting my hands on top of it. I told him we were not going to reject the application. I told him we were going to do the exact opposite. We were going to approve the initial due diligence phase of the loan and fast-track it through the underwriting department. Marcus blinked in confusion, reminding me that the company was a massive financial liability. I explained that I had absolutely no intention of actually funding her failing brand. But by federal law, moving a high-risk mezzanine loan into the formal due diligence phase required the applicant to surrender complete unredacted access to their corporate history. To secure this specific type of funding, Brittany would be legally obligated to submit her company's unfalsified financial records, complete bank statements, and comprehensive tax returns for the past 5 years directly to our underwriting team. She would have to sign federal compliance waivers granting us total transparency into every single transaction, every hidden debt, and every corporate skeleton in her closet. If she lied or submitted forged documents during this phase, she would be committing federal wire fraud. I instructed Marcus to send the due diligence approval forms to her lawyers immediately, using the Meridian Financial Partners letterhead to maintain the illusion of a third-party transaction. I wanted her to think she had won. I wanted her to believe that her financial salvation was just a few signatures away. The trap was set with terrifying efficiency. Marcus left my office to execute the orders, and I turned my chair to look out over the city. My family had spent the last 24 hours painting me as a monster to the entire world, leveraging public sympathy to extort me. They thought they were holding all the cards because they had a viral video and a tragic story. They had no idea they had just walked willingly into a financial slaughterhouse. By the following afternoon, the strategy yielded spectacular results. Brittany's legal team, clearly frantic for the cash injection, rushed the paperwork through at record speed. Marcus returned to my office with a digital hard drive containing everything we had asked for. Brittany had eagerly complied, signing away full access to her entire financial existence. She had executed the federal waivers without a second thought, completely blinded by the illusion of incoming millions. She truly believed she had secured the cash and outsmarted the system. She had no idea she had just handed the sister she despised the exact ammunition needed to dismantle her entire life, legally, systematically, and permanently. I authorized my team of forensic accountants to begin tearing through the submitted files immediately. I told them to look for every discrepancy, every misallocated fund, and every questionable tax write-off. I wanted a comprehensive audit of Brittany's entire corporate structure, and I wanted it done with absolute precision. The accounting team descended on the files like wolves working late into the night to unravel the tangled mess of my sister's finances. The sheer volume of data was staggering, but my team was the best in the industry. They knew exactly where to look for hidden liabilities and fraudulent reporting. As the days dragged on, the public relations nightmare outside my building continued to rage. The GoFundMe campaign my parents had launched was gaining traction, fueled by Brittany's relentless social media updates playing the grieving, desperate victim. The board of directors at Apex Holdings sent me multiple urgent emails, their panic escalating as our firm's name was repeatedly dragged through the mud on national television. They pleaded with me to issue a statement to defend myself, to do anything to stop the bleeding of our corporate reputation. But I held firm to my radio silence directive. I knew that engaging with their circus would only legitimize their claims. I was perfectly content to let them scream into the void while I quietly gathered the evidence that would destroy them. I sat in my office late on a Thursday evening, the city lights beginning to flicker on outside my window. The building was mostly empty, the quiet hum of the ventilation system, the only sound breaking the silence. I was reviewing the preliminary findings from the forensic audit when my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Ryan asking when I would be home for dinner. Instead, an unfamiliar local number flashed across the display. I rarely answered unknown calls, especially in the midst of a media scandal, but a strange intuition told me to pick up. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of static and heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Then a voice spoke, dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. It was Linda. She had clearly acquired a new prepaid phone to bypass the block my legal team had placed on her original number. "Hannah, darling," she said, her tone entirely devoid of the venom she had spewed in my lobby just days earlier. "I know things have been terribly tense between us lately, and I know we both said things we regret, but it is almost the holidays, and your father and I have been doing a lot of soul-searching. We want to put all of this ugly business behind us. We want to be a family again. We are hosting a reconciliation Thanksgiving dinner at the Oakwood Country Club next week, and it would mean the absolute world to us if you would attend. Just to talk, just to heal." I listened to her voice, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated manipulation. She was inviting me to an upscale country club for a holiday dinner, acting as though the viral smear campaign, the extortion contract, and the public humiliation had never happened. She wanted to play the role of the forgiving mother, extending an olive branch to her wayward daughter. I knew exactly what this was. It was a trap. It was a calculated performance designed to lure me into a public setting where they could exert pressure and manipulate me into signing their ridiculous contract. But as I sat in the quiet of my office, surrounded by the damning financial records my sister had just willingly handed over, a cold, sharp realization settled over me. They wanted a performance. They wanted a public spectacle. And I was finally ready to give them exactly what they were asking for. I stared at the thick dossier resting on my desk. The corporate logo for Lux & Company was embossed in garish gold foil that perfectly encapsulated my sister's superficial aesthetic. Marcus stood silently near the doorway, waiting for my reaction. He knew the history of the viral video, but he did not know the sheer magnitude of the poetic justice sitting right in front of me. I opened the heavy cover and read the executive summary. Brittany was applying for an $8 million mezzanine loan through a firm called Meridian Financial Partners, a silent private equity group known for issuing high-risk corporate bailouts to distressed lifestyle brands. What my sister and her overpriced legal team had completely failed to realize was that Meridian Financial Partners was a shadow subsidiary. It was a firm 100% owned, operated, and controlled by Apex Holdings. She was begging for a financial lifeline from the exact same corporate entity she was currently attempting to destroy on social media. I leafed through the preliminary balance sheets Marcus had compiled, and a cold smile touched the corners of my lips. Lux and Company was actively hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate. Brittany had structured the company as a personal piggy bank to fund an impossibly lavish lifestyle draining capital to pay for leased luxury vehicles, exorbitant commercial rent, and relentless personal spending disguised as corporate marketing expenses. There were line items for first-class flights, invoices for designer wardrobes, and recurring charges for a private yacht charter labeled as team-building exercises. According to the notes in the margin, she had a line of angry vendors threatening immediate litigation for unpaid invoices. She was relying on this specific shadow loan to keep her house of cards from collapsing and to silence the creditors who were rapidly closing in on her. I looked up at Marcus, who was watching me with a mixture of professional curiosity and apprehension. He cleared his throat, tentatively asking if I wanted him to reject the application outright, citing the obvious conflict of interest and the disastrous public relations campaign she had just launched against me. I shook my head slowly, closing the red folder. I told him we were going to do the exact opposite. We were going to approve the initial due diligence phase of the loan and fast-track it through underwriting. Marcus blinked in confusion, reminding me that the company was a massive financial liability and a guaranteed default. I explained that I had absolutely no intention of actually funding her failing brand. But by federal law, moving a high-risk mezzanine loan into the formal due diligence phase required the applicant to surrender complete unredacted access to their corporate history. To secure this specific type of funding, Brittany would be legally obligated to submit her company's unfalsified financial records, complete bank statements, and comprehensive tax returns for the past 5 years directly to our underwriting team. She would have to sign federal compliance waivers granting us total transparency into every single transaction, every hidden debt, and every corporate skeleton in her closet. If she lied or submitted forged documents during this phase, she would be committing federal wire fraud. I instructed Marcus to send the due diligence approval forms to her lawyers immediately, using the Meridian Financial Partners letterhead to maintain the illusion of a blind transaction. I wanted her to think she had won. The trap was set with terrifying efficiency. Marcus left my office to execute the orders, and I turned my chair to look out over the city. My family had spent the last 48 hours painting me as a monster to the entire world, leveraging public sympathy to extort me. They thought they were holding all the cards because they had a viral video and a tragic story. They had no idea they had just walked willingly into a financial slaughterhouse. By the following afternoon, the strategy yielded spectacular results. Brittany's legal team, clearly frantic for the cash injection, rushed the paperwork through at record speed. Marcus returned to my office with a digital hard drive containing everything we had asked for. Brittany had eagerly complied, signing away full access to her entire financial existence. She had executed the federal waivers without a single second thought, completely blinded by the illusion of incoming millions. She truly believed she had secured the cash and outsmarted the system. She had no idea she had just handed the sister she despised the exact ammunition needed to dismantle her entire life legally, systematically, and permanently. I authorized my team of forensic accountants to begin tearing through the submitted files immediately. I gave them explicit instructions to leave no stone unturned. I wanted them to look for every discrepancy, every misallocated fund, every phantom employee, and every questionable tax write-off. The accounting team descended on the files like wolves, working late into the night to unravel the tangled mess of my sister's finances. The sheer volume of raw data was staggering, but my team was the best in the industry. They knew exactly where to look for hidden liabilities, fraudulent reporting, and illegal commingling of personal and corporate assets. Within hours, they were already finding massive irregularities that bordered on criminal embezzlement. As the days dragged on, the public relations nightmare outside my building continued to rage. The GoFundMe campaign my parents had launched was gaining immense traction, fueled by Britney's relentless social media updates, playing the grieving, desperate victim. The board of directors at Apex Holdings sent me multiple urgent emails, their panic escalating as our firm's name was repeatedly dragged through the mud on national television. They pleaded with me to issue a statement, to defend myself, to do anything to stop the bleeding of our corporate reputation. But I held firm to my radio silence directive. I knew that engaging with their circus would only legitimize their ridiculous claims. I was perfectly content to let them scream into the void, collecting their donations and basking in their false sense of victory, while I quietly gathered the evidence that would destroy them. I sat in my office late on a Thursday evening, the city lights beginning to flicker on outside my window. The building was mostly empty, the quiet hum of the ventilation system breaking the heavy silence. I was reviewing a particularly damning spreadsheet detailing Britney's fraudulent tax deductions when my personal cell phone buzzed on the polished desk. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Ryan, or perhaps an update from Marcus. Instead, an unfamiliar local number flashed across the display. I rarely answered unknown calls, especially in the midst of a massive media scandal, but a strange nagging intuition told me to pick up. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of static and heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Then a voice spoke, dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that instantly made my skin crawl. It was Linda, my mother. She had clearly acquired a new prepaid phone to bypass the block my legal team had placed on her original number. "Hannah, darling," she said, her tone entirely devoid of the venom and entitlement she had spewed in my lobby just days earlier. "I know things have been terribly tense between us lately, and I know we both said things we regret. But it is almost the holidays, and your father and I have been doing a lot of soul-searching. We want to put all of this ugly business behind us. We want to put the past in the past and be a family again." I listened to her voice, marveling at the sheer manipulation dripping from every syllable. She was inviting me to an upscale country club for a holiday dinner, acting as though the viral smear campaign and the public humiliation had never happened. She wanted to play the role of the forgiving mother, extending an olive branch, completely ignoring the fact that she was currently using the internet to destroy my life. She continued, her voice taking on a pleading, victimized quality. "We are hosting a reconciliation Thanksgiving dinner at the Oakwood Country Club next week, and it would mean the absolute world to us if you would attend. Just to talk, just to heal. We want to make things right, Hannah." I looked at the black leather billfold sitting on the center of my pristine white china plate, then slowly raised my eyes to meet my father's gaze. David was leaning back in his upholstered chair, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face as he swirled his $300 vintage Cabernet. Beside him, Linda was picking at the remnants of her lobster thermidor, her chin tilted upward in arrogant entitlement. Brittany crossed her arms over her chest, the diamonds on her wrists catching the ambient light of the country club dining room. They had spent the last 2 hours treating me like an incompetent child, loudly bragging to anyone in earshot about the massive corporate buyout Brittany was supposedly securing. They had ordered the most expensive items on the menu, running up a $4,500 tab, all while making backhanded comments about my little finance job. And now they expected me to pay for the privilege of their abuse. I did not sigh or raise my voice to cause a scene. I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact with my father as I reached into my tailored handbag. My fingers found the cool, heavy metal of my Black Centurion card. I withdrew it smoothly, the solid weight of the card, a physical manifestation of the empire I had built from the ashes they left me in. Wordlessly, I opened the leather folder, placed the card inside, and closed it. When the waiter appeared moments later, bowing slightly in deference, I handed him the folder with a polite nod. He took it and melted away into the busy dining room, leaving my family exchanging triumphant congratulatory glances. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully dominated the evening and forced me back into my designated role as the submissive scapegoat who would simply absorb their insults without consequence. I reached for my crystal water goblet and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice-cold water felt grounding. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the ambient noise of the country club to fill the space between us. I listened to the clinking of expensive silverware against china and the low conversations of wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables. Linda leaned forward, resting her elbows on the fine linen tablecloth. "That is the least you could do." "Hannah," my mother said, her voice carrying a sharp, condescending edge, "after ignoring our phone calls all week and making your father worry, picking up the check is a small step toward repairing the damage you have caused this family. You should be grateful we even invited you tonight after the stunt you pulled in your lobby." I set my water glass down on the table, the base making a soft, muted thud against the fabric. I folded my hands together and rested them in my lap, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. It was the absolute clarity that comes right before the execution of a flawless strategy. You know, it is fascinating how the corporate world operates. I began keeping my voice conversational, pleasant, and entirely stripped of any emotional weight. People see the name of a massive holding company and fail to realize how vast and interconnected its subsidiaries truly are. A firm like Apex Holdings does not just manage wealth. We acquire, we absorb, and we operate dozens of smaller silent entities that function entirely under the radar. David scoffed loudly, waving a thick hand in the air. "Oh, here we go," he grumbled, looking at Linda with an exaggerated roll of his eyes. "We are trying to have a nice family holiday dinner, and she has to start lecturing us about her boring finance job. Nobody cares about your corporate subsidiaries, Hannah. We were just talking about Brittany's multi-million-dollar buyout. That is real business, real success." I kept my gaze fixed on my father, but my words were aimed directly at my sister. "Real success," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air for a fraction of a second. That is an interesting choice of phrasing, because my forensic accounting team is currently in the middle of conducting a deep dive audit on a lifestyle brand that is anything but a real success. In fact, this particular retail company is actively hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate. The owner has been bleeding capital to fund leased luxury vehicles and exorbitant personal expenses, while desperately ignoring a line of angry vendors threatening immediate litigation for unpaid invoices. Brittany's smug expression faltered. The easy, confident posture she had maintained all evening suddenly went rigid. Her hands slowly curled into tight fists. I leaned forward just slightly, lowering my voice so that only the four of us could hear the absolute devastation in my words. "This failing company," I continued, my tone smooth and relentless, "is so entirely desperate for cash that they submitted an application for a high-risk mezzanine loan to a silent private equity group called Meridian Financial Partners. They thought it was a lifeline to avoid bankruptcy. They eagerly signed federal compliance waivers and handed over 5 years of unredacted, unfalsified financial records, bank statements, and tax returns to secure the funding." Brittany stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her skin took on a sickening ashen pallor. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "What the CEO of this failing company was too incredibly stupid to realize," I said, finally turning my eyes to lock directly onto Brittany's terrified gaze, "is that Meridian Financial Partners is a shadow subsidiary that is 100% owned and operated by Apex Holdings. She was so desperate for a bailout that she willingly handed over every single one of her hidden ledgers and corporate skeletons directly to the sister she abandoned at a train station." The silence at our table was suddenly deafening. Brittany was physically trembling, her eyes wide and fixed on me with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. She was connecting the dots in real time, realizing that the anonymous investor she had been bragging about to her friends, the financial savior she thought would fund her summer home and silence her creditors, was actually me. She realized that I now possessed complete legal access to every fraudulent tax deduction, every misallocated fund, and every desperate financial maneuver she had made over the last half-decade. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, shallow gasps of air as her chest heaved under her designer silk blouse. She knew she was caught in a trap of her own making, and there was absolutely no way out. My parents, however, completely failed to read the room. They lacked the basic financial literacy required to understand the magnitude of what I had just revealed. Linda looked at me with intense irritation, while David let out a harsh laugh. "You are just jealous," my father sneered, entirely oblivious to the fact that his golden child was currently suffocating on her own panic across from him. I did not bother to correct him. I stood up, smoothed my tailored suit, and thanked them for the meal before walking out of the dining room. Just as I stepped into my waiting car, my personal phone buzzed in my hand. My lead forensic accountant had sent me a secure encrypted text message. "You need to see these ledgers immediately. They are not just in debt, they are committing federal crimes." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the harsh blue light casting a cold, sharp reflection against the tinted windows of the luxury town car. The satisfying rush of outsmarting my sister at the country club vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a clinical focus. I typed a single word in response, instructing my lead accountant to assemble the legal team in the main boardroom. I leaned forward, tapping the thick glass partition that separated me from my driver, and instructed him to reroute our vehicle to the Apex Holdings headquarters without delay. The city streets blurred past in streaks of neon and brake lights as my mind raced through the implications. I had initially expected to find gross incompetence. I had expected to uncover corporate waste. I had expected Brittany to be running her company into the ground out of sheer vanity and financial illiteracy. I had not expected to uncover systemic federal criminality. The highly secure executive boardroom on the 50th floor was bathed in stark, unforgiving fluorescent light when I finally pushed through the heavy glass double doors. Marcus was already there, standing silently beside Arthur, the brilliant and notoriously ruthless head of my forensic accounting division. The mahogany table was completely obscured by an ocean of printed ledgers, highlighted bank statements, and tax documents, all pulled directly from the digital hard drive Brittany had so willingly surrendered. Arthur did not offer a polite greeting. He simply pushed a thick, heavily bound folder toward my leather chair as I sat down. He looked incredibly grim, his usual professional demeanor wound impossibly tight. He explained that his team had run the initial numbers 3 separate times just to be absolutely certain before contacting me. What they had uncovered went far beyond simple mismanagement or standard civil liabilities. I opened the heavy folder and began to read the meticulously highlighted sections as Arthur methodically walked me through the incredibly tangled web of my family's financial depravity. Lux & Company was not a functioning, legitimate retail brand. It was a highly orchestrated, incredibly desperate criminal front. Arthur pointed his pen to a series of offshore transfers and shell company accounts that had been deliberately set up to hide massive capital movements. He explained that Brittany and David had been actively soliciting tens of millions of dollars from private investors under the strict guise of expanding her brand footprint and opening new retail locations. But the newly injected money was never used for corporate infrastructure or product development. Instead, it was immediately siphoned off into private personal accounts, controlled exclusively by my father and my sister. I traced my finger down a long column of outrageous expenses, my stomach turning cold as I read the line items. Investor capital had been systematically and relentlessly embezzled to pay for David's exorbitant country club initiation fees and his annual 6-figure membership dues. It had been utilized to fully fund Linda's luxury vacations to St. Bart's and Aspen, deliberately categorized on the corporate ledgers as overseas marketing research and brand development trips. Brittany's leased sports cars, her penthouse rent, her designer wardrobe, all of it was purchased using stolen investor money. But the absolute depravity of their actions did not stop with simple, straightforward theft. Marcus stepped forward, handing me a secondary color-coded file containing their federal tax returns for the past 5 years. He explained that in order to keep the vital influx of private investor cash moving, Brittany and David had been reporting entirely fabricated profits to the IRS. They were actively paying massive federal tax liabilities on money they had never actually earned, sacrificing a portion of their stolen funds just to maintain the illusion of a highly profitable solvent retail company. When early investors inevitably began demanding their promised returns, my family instituted a textbook entirely illegal Ponzi scheme. They used the capital directly from new investors to quietly and desperately pay off the old ones, frantically trying to keep the entire fraudulent structure from imploding under the weight of its own deceit. A sudden, sickening realization washed over me as the final confusing puzzle pieces finally snapped together perfectly. The aggressive, highly orchestrated ambush in my corporate lobby, the vicious viral smear campaign launched across social media platforms, the ridiculous extortion contract demanding exactly $500,000 in exchange for their silence. None of that was driven by simple greed or a petty desire to punish me for my success. It was absolute, unadulterated, sheer panic. The Ponzi scheme was rapidly collapsing. They had created a massive, insurmountable federal deficit, and the flow of new investor money had finally dried up completely. They desperately needed my $500,000 to quietly cover a massive gap in their fraudulent ledgers before the federal authorities or their defrauded investors caught on to the scheme. They had tried to bleed me dry to save themselves from decades in federal prison. I closed the heavy folder and looked up at my dedicated team. The air in the boardroom was thick with heavy anticipation. Marcus softly asked if I wanted to formally reject the mezzanine loan application, return their digital files, and simply walk away from the mess. I shook my head slowly, my voice entirely steady and completely devoid of any lingering emotion. I told him we were officially rejecting the loan, but we were absolutely keeping the files. I instructed my lead corporate attorney to immediately begin compiling every single forged ledger, every fraudulent tax return, and every undeniable proof of embezzlement into a comprehensive, airtight, and devastating dossier. I told them to format the evidence perfectly, leaving absolutely no room for ambiguity, plausible deniability, or legal loopholes. We were not just going to casually deny Brittany her financial lifeline. We were going to submit the entire unredacted dossier directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The assembled legal and accounting teams immediately sprang into highly coordinated action. For the next 3 grueling hours, I sat at the head of the mahogany table, meticulously reviewing every document, verifying every timeline, and ensuring that the narrative of their extensive fraud was entirely irrefutable. I watched in silence as my team methodically packaged the absolute destruction of my family's criminal enterprise. There was no hesitation in my heart, no lingering sense of familial loyalty or misplaced guilt. They had burned that bridge years ago, and they had salted the earth when they tried to actively extort me. This was simply the natural, inevitable, and legally mandated consequence of their own arrogant criminal actions. Finally, Arthur stepped forward and placed the completed formal SEC whistleblower authorization form directly in front of me. I picked up my favorite heavy fountain pen, the smooth metal grounding my racing thoughts. I carefully read over the formal declaration certifying that the attached evidence of federal wire fraud and systemic embezzlement was authentic and obtained entirely legally through the applicant's own voluntary due diligence submission. As I pressed the sharp nib of the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name in a sharp, fluid motion, a harsh, sudden vibration rattled loudly against the mahogany table. My personal cell phone screen lit up with a brilliant, flashing red banner, instantly overriding all of my standard messages and notifications. It was a silent security breach alert. My eyes darted to the bold text scrolling rapidly across the illuminated screen. My penthouse's secure private elevator alarm had just been triggered. I stared at the pulsing red notification on my screen, the gravity of the alert temporarily stalling my breath. My private elevator was coded to only accept my biometric scan or Ryan's authorized keycard. Anyone else attempting to bypass the security protocols directly to the top floor would trigger an immediate lockdown. I placed my heavy fountain pen down onto the mahogany boardroom table and pulled my tablet from my leather briefcase. Arthur and Marcus watched me in tense silence, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, but I simply raised a hand to ask for a moment. I slowly tapped the security application on my screen, effortlessly, bypassing the complicated encrypted firewall to access the live feed from the cameras, discreetly positioned throughout my entire building and inside my home. The high-definition video loaded instantly, displaying a crisp, flawless split screen of the ground floor lobby and my private foyer. The scene playing out in the lobby was a masterpiece of amateur theatrics. Linda was slumped against the polished marble reception desk, clutching her chest with one hand while using her other hand to lean heavily against the terrified young concierge. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure agony, and she was visibly panting, playing the role of a frail elderly woman experiencing a severe life-threatening medical emergency. The concierge, a college student named Liam, who had only been working at the building for a month, was in an absolute state of panic. He was desperately trying to support her weight while reaching for the lobby telephone. I watched as my mother weakly pointed upward toward the penthouse, mouthing my name, and Ryan's name, pantomiming that she just needed to get upstairs to her family. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I was at the office. She knew Ryan worked from home on Thursday evenings. She was weaponizing Liam's basic human decency, manipulating a panicked, inexperienced kid into overriding strict federal privacy protocols to unlawfully grant her direct access to my home. Liam swiped his master keycard over the elevator console, his face pale with worry, and physically helped my mother step into the wood-paneled car. The doors slid shut, and I immediately switched my tablet's focus to the camera positioned in my private foyer. The elevator doors glided open, and Linda stumbled forward, deliberately collapsing onto the plush carpet, just as Ryan stepped out from the main living area. He had clearly heard the emergency chime from the elevator shaft and rushed over to investigate. When he saw my mother writhing on the floor, clutching her chest and groaning about sharp pains and severe dizziness, his natural instincts kicked in. Ryan was fundamentally a kind, deeply empathetic man, entirely unaccustomed to the ruthless sociopathic games my family played on a daily basis. He immediately dropped to his knees beside her, his face etched with genuine alarm. I watched through the silent video feed as he spoke to her, his gestures frantic as he tried to assess her condition. Linda gripped his forearm, her knuckles turning white as she feigned another wave of extreme dizziness, dramatically letting her head loll back against the baseboard. She weakly gestured toward the kitchen, gasping, and clearly begging for a cold glass of water. Ryan did not hesitate for a single second. He nodded quickly, patted her shoulder to assure her he would be right back, and sprinted down the long hallway toward the kitchen. He was likely planning to grab the water and immediately dial emergency services. The moment his back disappeared around the corner, the entire dynamic of the video feed changed with a sudden chilling abruptness. The profound agony and crippling dizziness that had supposedly brought my mother to her knees completely vanished. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Linda stopped groaning. She released her dramatic grip on her chest. Her posture instantly straightened, and the mask of the frail, dying woman dissolved into a sharp, calculated expression of pure, predatory intent. She pushed herself off the expensive carpet with a startling fluid agility that completely belied her age, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer slacks with a quick, dismissive brush of her hands. She did not waste a single second catching her breath. Instead, she turned her head, scanning the foyer to ensure the coast was completely clear, before darting silently in the opposite direction of the kitchen. She moved with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a thief, her rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound against the hardwood floors. I sat completely frozen in my boardroom chair, my blood turning to ice water as I tracked her movements across the security grid. She ignored the guest bedrooms, bypassed the main living areas, and headed straight down the eastern corridor toward my private home office. She had obviously memorized the layout of my penthouse during the brief, highly supervised visits I had allowed in the past. She reached the heavy oak door of my office, pressed her ear against the wood to listen for Ryan's returning footsteps, and then swiftly turned the brass handle, slipping inside and closing the door softly behind her. I tapped the screen, switching to the discreet camera positioned above my office bookshelves. The wide-angle lens captured every single corner of the room. Linda was already moving her eyes, darting across the space like a caged animal. She lunged for the solid mahogany desk in the center of the room, her hands tearing into the top drawers with frantic, desperate energy. She was clearly not casually browsing. She was tearing the space apart. She tossed aside luxury stationery, shoved decorative paperweights out of her way, and began ripping through my filing cabinets. She was hunting for bank account routing numbers, blank checkbooks, sensitive corporate passwords, or absolutely anything she could possibly use as leverage to extort me. She was desperately searching for the financial salvation Brittany's imploding company required to avoid total ruin and federal prosecution. I silently watched my mother completely ransack my personal sanctuary, a profound, lingering sense of deep disgust warring with a cold, highly analytical fascination. She was pulling out tax documents and tossing them onto the carpet, completely consumed by her manic search for a golden ticket. My phone buzzed again with a text from Ryan. He had reached the kitchen and was frantically asking if I was seeing the medical emergency unfolding in our foyer. I did not call the police. I did not hit the panic button to alert the building security team to physically remove her from the premises. Instead, I opened our message thread and kept my instructions brief, commanding, and entirely calm. I told Ryan to remain hidden in the kitchen for exactly 3 more minutes and to stay completely silent. I explained that it was a trap and that he was completely safe, but he needed to give her just a little bit more time. I turned my attention back to the high-resolution tablet screen, watching Linda grow increasingly frantic as she scoured the bottom drawers. She had not yet noticed the single thick leather folder I had left resting directly in the center of my desk. I watched with a dark, terrible anticipation, waiting for her to find exactly what she was looking for. It was a specifically planted, highly confidential folder containing a completely, thoroughly devastating financial summary, and I was finally going to let her open it. I placed my heavy fountain pen down onto the mahogany boardroom table and pulled my tablet from my leather briefcase. The pulsing red notification on the screen glared back at me, signaling a highly specific targeted intrusion. My private elevator was coded to only accept my biometric scan or Ryan's authorized keycard. Anyone else attempting to bypass the strict security protocols directly to the top floor would trigger an immediate silent alert. Arthur and Marcus watched me in tense silence, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, but I simply raised a hand to ask for a moment. I slowly tapped the security application on my screen, effortlessly bypassing the complicated encrypted firewall to access the live feed from the high-definition cameras discreetly positioned throughout my entire building and inside my home. The video loaded instantly, displaying a crisp, flawless split screen of the ground floor lobby and my private foyer. The scene playing out in the lobby was a masterpiece of amateur theatrics. Linda was slumped against the polished marble reception desk, clutching her chest with one hand while using her other hand to lean heavily against the terrified young concierge. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure agony, and she was visibly panting, playing the role of a frail, elderly woman experiencing a severe, life-threatening medical emergency. The concierge, a college student named Liam, who had only been working at the luxury building for a month, was in an absolute state of panic. He was desperately trying to support her weight while reaching for the lobby telephone. I watched as my mother weakly pointed upward toward the penthouse, mouthing my name and Ryan's name, pantomiming that she just needed to get upstairs to her family. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I was at the office. She knew Ryan worked from home on Thursday evenings. She was weaponizing Liam's basic human decency, manipulating a panicked, inexperienced kid into overriding strict federal privacy protocols to unlawfully grant her direct access to my home. Liam swiped his master keycard over the elevator console, his face pale with worry, and physically helped my mother step into the wood-paneled car. The doors slid shut, and I immediately switched my tablet's focus to the camera positioned in my private foyer. The elevator doors glided open, and Linda stumbled forward, deliberately collapsing onto the plush carpet just as Ryan stepped out from the main living area. He had clearly heard the emergency chime from the elevator shaft and rushed over to investigate. When he saw my mother writhing on the floor, clutching her chest and groaning about sharp pains and severe dizziness, his natural instincts kicked in. Ryan was fundamentally a kind, deeply empathetic man, entirely unaccustomed to the ruthless sociopathic games my family played on a daily basis. He immediately dropped to his knees beside her, his face etched with genuine alarm. I watched through the silent video feed as he spoke to her, his gestures frantic as he tried to assess her condition. Linda gripped his forearm, her knuckles turning white as she feigned another wave of extreme dizziness, dramatically letting her head loll back against the baseboard. She weakly gestured toward the kitchen, gasping and clearly begging for a cold glass of water. Ryan did not hesitate for a single second. He nodded, quickly patted her shoulder to assure her he would be right back, and sprinted down the long hallway toward the kitchen. He was likely planning to grab the water and immediately dial emergency services. The moment his back disappeared around the corner, the entire dynamic of the video feed changed with a sudden chilling abruptness. The profound agony and crippling dizziness that had supposedly brought my mother to her knees completely vanished. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Linda stopped groaning. She released her dramatic grip on her chest. Her posture instantly straightened, and the mask of the frail, dying woman dissolved into a sharp, calculated expression of pure predatory intent. She pushed herself off the expensive carpet with a startling fluid agility that completely belied her age, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer slacks with a quick, dismissive brush of her hands. She did not waste a single second catching her breath. Instead, she turned her head, scanning the foyer, to ensure the coast was completely clear before darting silently in the opposite direction of the kitchen. She moved with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a thief, her rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound against the hardwood floors. I sat completely frozen in my boardroom chair, my blood turning to ice water as I tracked her movements across the security grid. She ignored the guest bedrooms, bypassed the main living areas, and headed straight down the eastern corridor toward my private home office. She had obviously memorized the layout of my penthouse during the brief, highly supervised visits I had allowed in the past. She reached the heavy oak door of my office, pressed her ear against the wood to listen for Ryan's returning footsteps, and then swiftly turned the brass handle, slipping inside and closing the door softly behind her. I tapped the screen, switching to the discreet camera positioned above my office bookshelves. The wide-angle lens captured every single corner of the room. Linda was already moving, her eyes darting across the space like a caged animal. She lunged for the solid mahogany desk in the center of the room, her hands tearing into the top drawers with frantic, desperate energy. She was clearly not casually browsing. She was tearing the space apart. She tossed aside luxury stationery, shoved decorative paperweights out of her way, and began ripping through my filing cabinets. She was hunting for bank account routing numbers, blank checkbooks, sensitive corporate passwords, or absolutely anything she could possibly use as leverage to extort me. She was desperately searching for the financial salvation Brittany's imploding company required to avoid total ruin and federal prosecution. I silently watched my mother completely ransack my personal sanctuary, a profound, lingering sense of deep disgust warring with a cold, highly analytical fascination. She was pulling out tax documents and tossing them onto the carpet, completely consumed by her manic search for a golden ticket. My phone buzzed again with a text from Ryan. He had reached the kitchen and was frantically asking if I was seeing the medical emergency unfolding in our foyer. I did not call the police. I did not hit the panic button to alert the building security team to physically remove her from the premises. Instead, I opened our message thread and kept my instructions brief, commanding and entirely calm. I told Ryan to remain hidden in the kitchen for exactly 3 more minutes and to stay completely silent. I explained that it was a trap and that he was completely safe, but he needed to give her just a little bit more time. I turned my attention back to the high-resolution tablet screen, watching Linda grow increasingly frantic as she scoured the bottom drawers. Her frantic hands finally stilled. Her gaze locked onto the very center of my heavy mahogany desk where a solitary item sat perfectly illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a brass reading lamp. It was a thick red folder, identical in appearance to the one I had examined earlier that week, bearing a stark white label across the front. The text on the label was printed in bold, unmistakable letters: Lux and Company Mezzanine Funding Approval Draft. Even through the digital video feed, I could see the exact moment the realization hit her. The desperate, panicked energy that had fueled her ransacking evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, naked greed that distorted her features. Her eyes widened, practically glowing with a triumphant, predatory light. She reached out and snatched the heavy folder from the desk, her manicured fingers gripping the thick cardstock as if it were a solid bar of gold. She did not even bother to open it to verify the contents or read the fine print. The label alone was all the confirmation she needed. With practiced ruthless efficiency, she shoved the bulky red folder deep into the cavernous depths of her oversized designer handbag, snapping the gold clasp shut with a sharp, definitive click. She had what she came for. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy oak door of the office swung open. Ryan stepped into the room holding a tall glass of ice water, his face etched with genuine, honest concern. He had followed my encrypted text message instructions flawlessly, waiting exactly 3 minutes in the kitchen before returning, but the anxiety in his posture was entirely real. The moment the door handle turned, Linda executed a physical transformation that was genuinely terrifying to witness. Her spine curved, her shoulders slumped forward, and the sharp, calculating predator vanished into thin air. She pressed one hand against her chest and let out a weak, ragged sigh, leaning heavily against the polished edge of my desk for support. Ryan rushed to her side, offering the glass of water with a steady hand. He asked her gently if she was feeling any better, his voice a soothing contrast to the toxic manipulation filling the room. Linda took the glass with a trembling hand, taking a small, delicate sip before offering him a brave, pathetic smile. She told him that she was so incredibly sorry for the intrusion, claiming that the sudden wave of extreme dizziness had simply overwhelmed her, and she just needed a quiet, private place to sit down for a moment to catch her breath. She patted his arm, her voice dripping with artificial gratitude, assuring him that the frightening spell had passed and she was feeling entirely like herself again. Ryan offered to call a private car service or personally escort her down to the lobby, but my mother was already moving toward the door. The prize was secured in her bag, and she desperately needed to escape the penthouse before the fragile illusion fractured. She hastily excused herself, waving off his offers of assistance with a flurry of breathless apologies for interrupting his quiet evening. She practically scurried down the long hallway, her previous frailty completely forgotten, as she made a beeline for the private elevator. I watched her step inside the heavy metal doors sliding shut on her victorious, calculating smirk. Back in the secure boardroom of Apex Holdings, I lowered my tablet and set it gently face down on the polished table. A grim, entirely humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. Arthur and Marcus remained silent, watching me closely, waiting for my assessment of the situation. I looked at both of them and confirmed that the bait had been taken. The red folder Linda had just stolen from my desk was completely useless in any legal or financial capacity. It contained a meticulously fabricated draft of an approval document specifically designed to look exactly like an internal executive memo. The paperwork strongly suggested that the $8 million mezzanine loan for Brittany's failing retail company had cleared all internal underwriting hurdles and was fully slated to be funded by the end of the current month. It was a phantom lifeline, A mirage of incoming wealth crafted to look absolutely authentic to the untrained, desperate eye. It carried no weight, no actual signatures, and zero legal binding. I had orchestrated the entire scenario as a final definitive test of their morality. If Linda had simply come to my home to apologize, to seek genuine reconciliation, or even to beg for my help directly, the folder would have remained untouched on the desk. But my family had long ago abandoned any pretense of honesty, integrity, or basic human decency. Linda had deliberately faked a severe medical emergency, callously manipulated the man I loved, and actively committed a home invasion just to steal confidential corporate documents. She thought she was executing a brilliant covert operation to save her favorite daughter from bankruptcy. She had absolutely no idea that she had just stolen a worthless piece of paper that was specifically engineered to accelerate their ultimate downfall. I pictured my mother walking out of my building and stepping onto the busy city sidewalk, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her side like a shield. I knew exactly how she felt in that moment. She felt victorious. She felt brilliant. She felt that she had successfully outsmarted me in my own home, securing the definitive proof that Brittany's financial salvation was absolutely guaranteed. She was probably already dialing Brittany's number from the back of a luxury town car, breathlessly relaying the incredible news that the $8 million was practically in the bank. I turned my attention back to the massive pile of genuine, legally binding ledgers scattered across the boardroom table. We had serious work to do. My legal team needed to finish compiling the comprehensive dossier for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the stolen bait was merely the catalyst designed to push my family completely over the edge. I instructed Arthur to maintain a strict, continuous monitor on all of Brittany's known corporate and personal financial accounts. I knew my sister's psychology perfectly. The moment she believed the massive mezzanine loan was approved and the funds were secure, she would completely abandon whatever fragile, panicked restraint she had been exercising over the past few weeks. The hours ticked by as the city outside darkened into the deep, quiet hours of the night. The boardroom remained a hive of focused, relentless activity. We were cross-referencing offshore routing numbers and verifying the true extent of their tax fraud when a sharp, distinctive chime echoed from Arthur's specialized workstation at the far end of the mahogany table. Arthur sat up straight, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he pulled up the live data feed directly linked to the financial monitors tracking Lux and Company. He stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue light reflecting sharply in his glasses, before turning the large monitor so I could see the rapidly updating graphs. Within hours of the theft, Hannah's financial monitors flag a massive spike in Brittany's credit activity. Operating on the false assurance of the stolen approval document, Brittany has just started spending millions of dollars she doesn't actually have. I watched the red lines on Arthur's screen climb at a dizzying, almost perfectly vertical angle as the digital security alerts populated the interface. Brittany was not just opening new lines of credit. She was actively seeking out the most aggressive, entirely ruthless predatory lenders in the corporate underbelly of the city. These were shadow financiers who did not care about long-term solvency or retail market share. They only cared about immediate collateral. We tracked the digital footprints as she frantically leveraged the stolen draft approval document presenting the fabricated Apex Holdings memorandum to shady private equity brokers as ironclad proof of incoming capital. She used the $8 million phantom loan to secure immediate short-term bridge financing with extortionate, ruinous interest rates. It was a spectacular, breathtaking display of financial suicide. Lenders who specialized in high-risk corporate debt were instantly wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars into Lux and Company's operating accounts, fully believing that a massive institutional payout was just days away. And Brittany, completely blinded by her own arrogance and desperate need for validation, immediately began burning through the cash the second it hit her ledger. She did not pay her angry vendors. She did not settle the mounting federal tax liabilities Arthur had uncovered. She did not attempt to stabilize her crumbling corporate infrastructure or pay her desperately overworked retail staff. Instead, she threw gasoline on a blazing fire. The money flowed directly into vanity projects designed entirely to feed her ego and maintain her fraudulent image. Through our digital monitors, we watched her reserve the grand ballroom at the Beaumont Hotel, one of the most exclusive and outrageously expensive event spaces in the entire city. She was organizing a 10-year anniversary gala for Lux and Company, treating the failing brand as if it were a titan of industry. The vendor invoices pouring through her accounts were staggering and completely illogical. She ordered thousands of imported white orchids to cascade from the ceiling, secured a Michelin-starred catering team for a 6-course seated dinner, and put down a non-refundable $100,000 deposit for a celebrity DJ. She was effectively throwing a massive glittering celebration on the deck of a sinking ship, completely convinced that she had outsmarted me and secured an endless flow of institutional wealth. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. She genuinely believed that the red folder Linda had smuggled out of my penthouse was her ultimate victory, a permanent shield against the consequences of her own incompetence. The sheer scale of the event was a physical manifestation of her frantic need to prove her superiority. The false confidence quickly infected the rest of the family, spreading like a highly contagious disease. Over the next 2 weeks, my parents and my sister launched a relentless, highly coordinated campaign of aggressive social media posts. Linda uploaded endless streams of photographs showing off new designer jewelry and heavily filtered videos from expensive bridal boutiques, casually mentioning to her followers that her eldest daughter was currently securing the biggest corporate expansion of the decade. David took to his professional networking profiles, loudly bragging about his invaluable advisory role in Lux and Company's historic mezzanine funding round. He posted lengthy, arrogant essays about elite business acumen, the importance of aggressive growth strategies, and the power of family enterprise, entirely oblivious to the fact that his words were publicly documenting his direct involvement in a massive federal wire fraud scheme. Brittany was the worst of them all. She posted daily videos from the Beaumont Hotel ballroom, walking her followers through the extravagant gala preparations. She spoke to the camera with a smug, condescending smile, offering unsolicited advice on how to build a retail empire and casually mocking those who lacked her supposed vision and drive. They were riding a wave of absolute euphoria, completely intoxicated by the illusion of their own success. They felt untouchable. They had successfully manipulated my concierge, invaded my home, stolen my confidential documents, and secured the cash they needed to maintain their fraudulent lifestyle. They were celebrating their dominance, completely unaware that they were aggressively building their own gallows. I watched their digital gloating from the quiet sanctuary of my office, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical certainty. They were doing exactly what I needed them to do. They were maximizing their exposure, inflating their debt, and publicly tying themselves to the fraudulent funds just days before the Securities and Exchange Commission would receive my airtight dossier. The climax of their arrogant delusion arrived precisely 2 days before the anniversary gala. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex quarterly earnings report for one of our legitimate subsidiaries when my executive assistant softly knocked on the glass door. She walked in holding a thick, heavy envelope crafted from premium cream cardstock. It had been delivered by a private courier, requiring a direct signature, indicating a level of expense that was entirely unnecessary. The edges of the envelope were lined with thick gold foil, and my name was written across the front in elaborate, sweeping calligraphy. I broke the heavy wax seal and pulled out the invitation. It was a massive, weighty piece of acrylic deeply engraved with the Lux & Company logo and wrapped in a delicate silk ribbon. It formally requested my presence at the 10-year anniversary gala, boasting of a night of unprecedented corporate triumph and industry dominance. But the formal invitation was not the reason the private courier had been sent. Tucked neatly behind the acrylic card was a small, personalized piece of premium stationery. I pulled it out and immediately recognized Brittany's sharp, aggressive handwriting. I read the short, vicious message twice, letting the sheer audacity of her words sink in. Come see what real success looks like. Bring your checkbook so you can buy your way back into this family. Do not embarrass us. The note was a perfect encapsulation of everything my family stood for. It was a demand for absolute submission, wrapped securely in an insult, a desperate attempt to force me to witness her fabricated triumph while simultaneously demanding my financial obedience. She still genuinely believed she held all the power. She still believed I was the weak, insignificant scapegoat who would inevitably bow to her demands and absorb her abuse without consequence. I did not sigh. I did not crumble the heavy paper in anger. I calmly folded the nasty handwritten note and placed it neatly into the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. It was a beautiful, irreplaceable piece of physical evidence, a tangible record of her extortionate mindset, just hours before her entire world was going to violently collapse under the crushing weight of a federal investigation. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Ryan's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, a deeply grounding contrast to the toxic manipulation sitting heavily in my pocket. I kept my tone light conversational and entirely pleasant as I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, marveling at how easily they had fallen into the trap I had carefully laid. I told him to clear his schedule for Saturday night and to go down to the boutique on the corner to rent his absolute best tuxedo. I smiled grimly as I looked at the gold-embossed invitation resting on my mahogany desk. We were going to a party. It was finally time for them to face the cold, inevitable music. The Beaumont Hotel Grand Ballroom was a masterclass in aggressive excess. As Ryan and I stepped through the towering gilded doors, the sheer scale of Brittany's financial delusion hit me like a physical wave. She had spared no expense utilizing the phantom $8 million to construct a temporary monument to her own vanity. Massive arrangements of white orchids hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling, brushing the imported crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played in the corner, drowned out by the deafening roar of wealthy socialites. Waiters in white tailcoats circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and vintage champagne. Every single orchid and drop of champagne was actively funded by predatory, ruinous debt that she could never repay. Ryan adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket, his hand coming to rest securely against the small of my back. His steady presence was a grounding anchor amidst the chaos. We moved slowly into the room together, observing the entire spectacle with a cold, calculated clinical detachment. It did not take long to locate my parents. David and Linda were holding court near a towering champagne fountain dominating the center of the room. My father was holding a crystal flute, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogant pride, as he loudly recounted fabricated corporate triumphs to an audience of minor local politicians. Linda stood beside him, draped in an emerald green silk gown purchased using embezzled investor capital. She looked entirely triumphant, projecting the aura of a reigning queen. They were riding an absolute high, convinced they had beaten the system and permanently secured their lavish lifestyle. And then finally, I saw Brittany. She was holding court near the main stage, surrounded by a tight circle of lifestyle bloggers and fashion media reporters. She was positively dripping in diamonds. A heavy, glittering collar rested against her collarbone, matching bracelets circled her wrists, and chandelier earrings swung from her ears as she laughed. I knew instantly the stones were rented using fraudulent credit, and she had zero intention of returning them. As if sensing my gaze, Brittany turned her head. The easy, manufactured laugh died on her lips the second she spotted me standing near the entrance. I saw a flicker of something dark cross her features, instantly replaced by a wide, predatory smile. She excused herself from the reporters and began making a beeline straight toward us. The crowd naturally parted, allowing her to strut across the marble floor with the exaggerated confidence of a predator closing in on its trapped prey. She had specifically invited me to this highly public venue because she intended to use me as the ultimate prop in her egotistical performance. She wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of the city's elite, solidifying her own dominance once and for all. Ryan shifted his stance just slightly, his jaw setting into a hard line as my sister approached. Brittany stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking over my understated black evening gown with undisguised contempt. She locked her gaze onto mine, her smile widening into a sharp, vicious grin. I kept my expression entirely blank, a perfectly calm, unreadable mirror reflecting back all her frantic, desperate energy. "You actually came," Brittany said, her voice carrying a loud musical lilt, entirely for the benefit of the eavesdropping guests standing nearby. "I am so glad you decided to be sensible, Hannah. It is so important for family to be together on a night of such massive corporate success." I simply did not respond to her. I simply let her arrogant words hang heavily in the air, allowing the awkward silence to stretch out. Brittany's smile tightened, just a fraction irritated by my lack of submission. She suddenly reached out her fingers, digging sharply into my wrist like a vice. Before I could pull away, she turned toward the stage and raised her other hand high in the air, signaling the event coordinator. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Conversation gradually died down as hundreds of heads turned toward the front of the ballroom. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the massive crowd. "Come on, little sister," Brittany whispered, her voice dropping to a toxic hiss that only I could hear. "It is time for you to take your medicine. Do exactly as you are told and smile for the cameras." She practically dragged me toward the marble steps leading up to the elevated stage. Ryan immediately moved to intervene, but I caught his eye and gave him a single subtle shake of my head. I let her position me directly in the center of the stage under the glaring spotlights. A stage manager handed Brittany a sleek silver microphone. She tapped it once, the sound echoing loudly, commanding the absolute attention of every investor, socialite, and media reporter in the room. "Thank you everyone for joining us tonight to celebrate 10 years of Lux and Company." Brittany began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and practiced humility. "Tonight is about immense financial success, and it is about the unbreakable power of family." She turned to look at me, her eyes gleaming with malicious intent. She raised her free hand and placed it condescendingly on my shoulder. "As many of you know, building an empire is not easy. It requires sacrifice, and sometimes it requires leaving troubled people behind until they are ready to find their way back to the light. My little sister Hannah has struggled for a very long time. She ran away from our family. She lost her way, and she caused my parents a tremendous amount of unnecessary pain." The crowd was completely silent. I could see the uncomfortable, confused expressions on the faces of the investors in the front row. They had come to celebrate a corporate anniversary, and they were suddenly being subjected to a deeply uncomfortable family drama. But tonight, Brittany continued, her voice swelling with theatrical emotion, "Tonight is about forgiveness." Hannah finally realized the error of her ways. She came to us, she admitted how deeply she needed our guidance, and she asked to be allowed back into the fold. So in front of all of my esteemed colleagues and investors, I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of my troubled, runaway little sister for finally showing up to ask for forgiveness. "The family graciously accepts your apology, Hannah." Polite, highly confused applause immediately rippled through the massive grand ballroom. People were clapping hesitantly, exchanging bewildered glances as they tried to process the bizarre, patronizing display they had just witnessed. Linda and David were standing near the champagne fountain, clapping enthusiastically and beaming up at the stage, thoroughly enjoying the public degradation of their youngest daughter. Brittany turned to face me fully, the vicious, triumphant smirk firmly back in place. She had delivered her ultimate insult. She had publicly branded me as a failure, a troubled runaway begging for scraps from her table. She abruptly shoved the silver microphone toward my chest, expecting me to instinctively cower away from the bright lights. She expected me to stutter, to cry, or to offer a submissive, humiliating apology to appease her massive ego. Instead, I reached out and took the microphone from her hand. I did not shake. I did not look down at my feet. I gripped the cool metal with absolute terrifying authority, my eyes locking onto hers, with the cold, devastating precision of an executioner who had just been handed the axe. The heavy heat of the stage lights beat down on my shoulders, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the charged air between me and my sister. Brittany stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly with the sheer adrenaline of her cruel performance, looking completely expectant. She was waiting for the tears. She was waiting for my shoulders to slump, for my voice to crack, for me to surrender to her fabricated narrative. I stood under the bright spotlight, perfectly composed. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away from the hundreds of curious eyes boring into me from the crowded ballroom floor. I brought the microphone to my lips deliberately, letting a long, heavy second pass before I spoke. I looked out over the crowd of high-net-worth investors, influential socialites, and hungry lifestyle media reporters. They were all holding their breath, waiting for the dramatic climax of this bizarre family spectacle. Then I slowly turned my gaze directly back to my sister. "Brittany is right about one thing," I said. My voice echoed clearly and smoothly through the massive sound system. It did not shake. It carried the calm, resonant weight of a woman who held every single card in the deck. I let the words land, watching the absolute certainty in Brittany's eyes flicker and dim just a fraction. Family is about transparency. I continued, my tone perfectly conversational, but commanding enough to freeze the room. Which is why I am so honored to be here tonight as the CEO and sole owner of Apex Holdings, the private equity firm Brittany has been begging for a bailout. The sprawling ballroom went dead silent. It was not a gradual quieting, but an instantaneous, suffocating vacuum of sound. It was the specific kind of heavy silence that immediately follows a sudden, violent physical impact. The blood drained from Brittany's face, leaving her deeply tanned skin a sickening ashen gray. The smug, predatory smile that had been firmly plastered across her face just moments before completely vanished, instantly replaced by an expression of pure horror. Her jaw fell open slightly, but the air seemed trapped in her lungs. She stared at me, her eyes wide and panicked, as the catastrophic realization finally hit her. She had not outsmarted me. She had not secured a phantom $8 million loan from a nameless, faceless corporate entity. She had blindly handed the entire criminal blueprint of her failing company directly to me. Down on the polished marble floor, the devastating shockwave of my words radiated outward, hitting my parents with the force of a freight train. David had been in the middle of taking a celebratory sip from his crystal champagne flute. At the exact moment his brain processed the name Apex Holdings, his thick fingers simply went completely slack. The glass slipped from his grasp and plummeted toward the floor. It shattered loudly against the unforgiving marble, the sharp explosive crash echoing like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. Amber liquid splashed across the polished stone and splattered against the hem of Linda's emerald green silk gown. Linda gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air clearly audible through the quiet room. Her hand flew to her chest, her trembling fingers desperately clutching the heavy pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked up at the main stage with wide, terrified eyes, the triumphant glow of her evening completely extinguished by the sudden freezing reality of my revelation. The initial wave of profound shock that held the crowd captive finally began to fracture. The wealthy investors in the front rows, men and women whose entire careers were built on understanding market dynamics and corporate leverage, began to murmur. They exchanged nervous, highly confused glances. The carefully constructed illusion of Brittany's corporate dominance was being viciously stripped away in real time. They were rapidly connecting the dots, realizing that the lavish, glittering 10-year anniversary gala they were currently attending was not a celebration of legitimate retail success. It was a desperate, incredibly expensive facade, hiding a retail company that was actively begging for a massive private equity bailout just to keep the lights on. Whispers cascaded through the room like a sudden chilling breeze rustling through dry winter leaves. The media reporters, instantly sensing blood in the water, began raising their cameras, the rapid flashes going off in quick, blinding succession to capture the absolute devastation currently unfolding on the main stage. Brittany's panicked mind furiously struggled to keep up with the catastrophic collapse of her reality. I watched the frantic calculations behind her terrified eyes. She had spent the last 2 solid weeks riding a massive wave of false confidence, aggressively spending millions of dollars of borrowed high-interest money based entirely on a stolen, completely worthless piece of paper. She had paraded around the entire city, arrogantly boasting to everyone who would listen about her incredible business acumen and her massive incoming capital. And now the architect of her impending ruin was standing right in front of her, holding the microphone she had so willingly handed over. The immense cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her fragile, heavily inflated ego to bear. The cold, hard truth that she was entirely at my mercy finally broke through her thick wall of denial, and it ignited a sudden explosive panic. "You are lying!" Brittany shrieked, her voice incredibly shrill and desperate, entirely lacking the polished, measured control she had maintained just moments earlier. She lunged forward, her hands outstretched with her manicured claws bared, attempting to snatch the silver microphone back from my iron grip. She wanted to silence me. She needed to stop the devastating hemorrhage of her corporate reputation before it completely infected the entire room. "Someone call security!" she screamed, her voice cracking loudly over the sound system, as she stumbled clumsily toward me in her towering, impractical stiletto heels. "Get her off my stage right now!" Her violent movements were incredibly frantic, fueled by pure terror and entirely predictable. I did not step backward, and I did not raise my free hand to defend myself against her incoming assault. I easily, fluidly sidestepped her clumsy advance, letting her own forward momentum carry her completely past me. She stumbled awkwardly across the stage, her rented diamond collar shifting wildly against her neck as she desperately tried to catch her balance against the heavy metal microphone stand. The wealthy crowd gasped again, the sudden physical altercation completely shattering whatever tiny shred of remaining decorum the elegant evening held. I maintained my tight grip on the microphone, my voice never once losing its calm, steady, unbothered cadence. "I told you, Brittany," I said, projecting my measured words clearly over her frantic, breathless, and embarrassing protests. "Family is about complete transparency. There is absolutely no need for security to intervene tonight. We are simply sharing the honest, verified truth with your incredibly valued investors." Brittany spun around her chest, heaving rapidly, her eyes wild with a cornered, animalistic desperation. She opened her mouth to scream again, likely to order the panicked sound engineer to immediately cut my audio feed, but she was entirely too late. I had already silently signaled my dedicated accounting team waiting in the production booth. I slowly raised my free hand and pointed directly over her shaking shoulder, purposefully drawing the absolute undivided attention of every single person in the massive grand ballroom to the massive high-definition audiovisual screens positioned directly behind the stage. The massive digital displays flared brightly, casting a harsh white light across the darkened stage. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom as the elegant gold-scripted Lux & Company logo instantly vanished. In its place, a series of heavily redacted but undeniably damning financial documents filled the enormous screens. I had visited the audiovisual production booth earlier in the evening, handing the lead technician a secure USB drive and a crisp $100 bill with specific instructions on when to execute the file sequence. Now the fruits of Arthur and Marcus's relentless forensic audit were being broadcast in high definition to the most influential people in the city. The screens cycled methodically through the devastating evidence. Sharply declining bar graphs displayed Lux and Company's true operating deficits. Highlighted banking ledgers showed millions of dollars being frantically moved through unauthorized offshore routing numbers. Red circles illuminated the specific, undeniable discrepancies between what Brittany had reported to her investors and the bankrupt reality of her corporate accounts. The visual presentation was a masterclass in financial transparency, laying bare the absolute rot at the core of my sister's retail empire. Brittany slowly turned her head, her rented diamond chandelier earrings swinging wildly as she looked up at the towering screens behind us. The blood that had already drained from her face seemed to somehow retreat even further, leaving her looking completely hollowed out and entirely panicked. She stared at the illuminated bank transfers, her jaw working soundlessly, as her brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of her exposure. The arrogant predator who had dragged me onto the stage just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. I brought the silver microphone back to my lips. My voice cut through the rising tide of anxious whispers vibrating across the ballroom floor. Unfortunately, I announced, projecting my words with absolute, unwavering authority. Apex Holdings does not acquire companies built on federal wire fraud and embezzled investor funds. Your bailout is officially denied, Brittany. The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings and bounced against the crystal chandeliers. I watched the prominent investors sitting in the front rows physically recoil, their expressions twisting from confusion into dawning absolute horror. These were the men and women who had poured their personal fortunes into Lux and Company, trusting the polished facade my family had so aggressively maintained. Now they were staring directly at the undeniable proof that their money was gone, squandered on vanity projects and fraudulent expansion campaigns. I did not stop there. I kept my gaze locked onto my sister, ensuring she heard every single syllable of her own destruction. And since you used a stolen forged draft of a non-existent deal as collateral to pay for tonight's party, I assume your creditors will be speaking with you shortly. The silence in the room finally broke, completely shattering under the weight of the revelation. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The investors in the front rows leaped out of their plush velvet chairs, shouting furiously over one another. Faces that had been relaxed and celebratory just minutes before were now contorted with genuine rage and pure financial panic. A wealthy venture capitalist, whom I recognized from previous industry galas, pointed a shaking finger at the screens, demanding to know where his capital had gone. Another investor began shouting for his legal counsel, his voice entirely hoarse with desperation. The carefully curated elite atmosphere of the anniversary gala devolved instantly into an angry, terrified mob. The lifestyle media reporters and society bloggers, realizing they were witnessing the corporate implosion of the decade, surged forward. They completely abandoned any pretense of decorum, holding their cell phones high in the air to record the shouting investors, the glaring financial audits on the screens, and the absolute meltdown happening on the main stage. The relentless, blinding flashes of their cameras illuminated the room in rapid, chaotic bursts of white light. Brittany could not handle the noise. She could not handle the glaring lights or the furious, demanding shouts of the people she had swindled. The sheer crushing reality of her public unmasking broke whatever fragile mental barrier she had left. She stumbled backward, her tall stiletto heels catching on the carpeted edge of the stage riser. She lost her balance and fell hard against the heavy metal base of a speaker stand, her elegant designer gown tangling around her legs. She did not try to get back up. Instead, she brought her hands to her face and began sobbing hysterically. Her makeup smeared down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks as she cried out, screaming over and over again that it was all a lie. She wailed into her hands frantically, telling the angry crowd that I had set her up, that the documents were fabricated, and that I was just a jealous, vindictive sister trying to ruin her special night. But her desperate, breathless lies held absolutely no weight against the glowing screens behind her. The forensic accounting was simply irrefutable. Every single transaction, every single routed payment, every single instance of gross embezzlement was documented with pristine, undeniable clarity. The crowd of investors did not care about her tears. They only cared about the highlighted bank statements proving she had actively stolen from them to fund the very champagne they had been drinking all evening. The shouts grew louder, more demanding, drowning out her pathetic, dramatic sobs. Ryan stepped up onto the stage, moving smoothly to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. His presence was a solid, comforting wall against the rising tide of anger filling the room. He did not look at Brittany weeping on the floor. He kept his eyes scanning the crowd, maintaining a protective, watchful stance as the situation continued to escalate. I felt a deep, profound sense of finality wash over me. The years of gaslighting, the endless financial manipulation, the constant suffocating pressure to submit to their toxic demands had finally come to an end. I had dragged their darkest secrets into the glaring light of day, and the fire they had started was finally consuming them. Suddenly, a violent commotion erupted near the back of the crowd. The tight knot of furious investors was forcefully shoved apart as David pushed his way through the chaos. My father was no longer the confident, arrogant patriarch holding court by the champagne fountain. His face was turned an unnatural, mottled shade of purple, his features completely distorted by an unhinged, explosive rage. He aggressively shouldered a prominent socialite out of his way, ignoring her indignant gasp as he marched furiously toward the front of the room. He reached the edge of the stage and did not bother using the side stairs. He physically hauled himself up onto the platform, his breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps. He ignored Brittany, who was still weeping hysterically on the floor. He ignored the glowing screens broadcasting his family's federal crimes. He marched straight toward me, his entire body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable fury. He stopped just a few feet away, raising a trembling, accusatory finger and pointing it directly at my face. "You ungrateful brat!" he screamed, his voice cracking with the sheer volume of his anger entirely audible even over the deafening roar of the panicked crowd. "You think you can destroy us? We will just leverage the family estate. We will sue you for defamation and take every penny you have." I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I looked at the man who had once driven me to a crowded train station and drove away, leaving me to fend for myself with nothing but a suitcase. His face was a mask of pure entitlement. He truly believed his position as the family patriarch granted him absolute immunity from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. He believed that no matter how deep of a hole they dug, there would always be another asset to leverage, another bank to manipulate, another victim to exploit. But the well had finally run dry. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not need to. The heavy silence of the grand ballroom amplified my words, carrying them to every single corner of the cavernous space. "You cannot leverage a house you no longer own, David," I stated. My voice was as cold and sharp as cracked ice slicing effortlessly through the chaotic noise of the room. The words hit him with a physical force. His arm, which had been raised to point that trembling finger at my face, slowly dropped to his side. The aggressive forward momentum of his body completely halted. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its thunderous volume, replaced by a sudden creeping uncertainty. "That estate has been in my name for 30 years. You are speaking nonsense. I am speaking about the second mortgage you quietly took out 5 years ago to fund Linda's extravagant lifestyle." I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than his absolute financial ruin. "I am speaking about the fact that you defaulted on that exact mortgage 3 months ago because you funneled your remaining liquid assets into Brittany's failing retail company to keep it afloat. The bank was preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings. Apex Holdings stepped in and bought your debt from the bank yesterday morning in a private expedited portfolio sale." I let the heavy reality of the transaction settle over him. I watched the arrogant bluster physically drain out of his body. "The estate is mine," I said, the finality of the statement ringing through the sound system. "The deed transferred to my corporate holding company this afternoon. You no longer have an ancestral home to leverage. You no longer have an asset to borrow against. You have absolutely nothing left to sell. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises before my legal team initiates a forced, highly publicized eviction." David stopped dead in his tracks. The furious purple coloring of his face rapidly faded into a sickly gray. His eyes widened, darting back and forth, as his brain frantically searched for a loophole, a lie he could spin to escape the trap. But there was no escape. He knew the terms of his default. He knew the catastrophic state of his finances. The reality of his total financial ruin crashed down on him with the crushing weight of a collapsed building. He brought a trembling hand to the center of his chest, clutching the lapel of his expensive tuxedo jacket as he struggled to draw a breath. He looked incredibly small, suddenly reduced to a fragile, broken old man who had finally run out of other people's money to spend. Down on the floor, Linda let out a piercing, high-pitched wail. It was not a dignified cry. It was a loud, animalistic shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. She threw herself forward, her emerald silk gown tangling around her legs as she desperately clung to David's arm. She was shaking him, begging him to tell her that I was lying, demanding that he fix the situation immediately. She looked wildly around the room, searching the faces of the wealthy socialites and prominent politicians she had spent decades trying to impress. She was looking for an ally, for someone to step in and save her social standing. But the crowd offered her nothing but cold, judging stares. The prominent investors were already turning their backs, pulling out their cell phones to urgently contact their own legal representation. The society bloggers were typing furiously, documenting the spectacular downfall of the city's most arrogant family. No one was coming to rescue them. The entire family was exposed completely bankrupt and publicly destroyed. And the most beautiful, vindicating part of it all was that I had not destroyed them through vindictiveness or illegal manipulation. I had simply stepped out of their way and allowed the sheer accumulated weight of their own criminal incompetence to finally crush them. Brittany was still huddled on the floor of the stage near the speaker stand, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, ragged sobs. Her rented diamond collar sparkled mockingly in the bright stage lights, a glittering symbol of the massive fraud that had brought her to this exact moment. She had wanted to use this gala to humiliate me, to assert her dominance, and to parade me around as the troubled sister who had finally come begging for her forgiveness. Instead, she had provided me with the perfect, highly publicized platform to pull the rug out from under her entire fraudulent existence. I looked down at the three of them, my mother weeping loudly, my father clutching his chest in silent shock, and my sister curled into a pathetic ball on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual guilt. The heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligation that had choked me for my entire life finally snapped, falling away into nothingness. I was completely, wonderfully free. I reached up and calmly flipped the small switch on the side of the silver microphone, instantly cutting the audio feed to the massive speakers. The sudden absence of my amplified voice made the room feel incredibly stark and real. I turned away from my family, dismissing them entirely, and walked slowly toward the edge of the stage. A young, terrified waiter in a white tailcoat was standing frozen near the stairs, clutching a silver tray of champagne glasses to his chest, like a protective shield. I stopped in front of him and gently placed the heavy microphone directly onto his tray, right between two crystal flutes. Ryan was waiting for me at the bottom of the marble steps. His face was a picture of steady, unwavering support. He held out his hand and I took it, his warm, solid grip grounding me instantly. We turned our backs on the stage, preparing to walk out of the grand ballroom and leave the wreckage of my family's legacy far behind us. As we took our first step toward the gilded exit doors, a new sound pierced the heavy, chaotic atmosphere of the venue. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the dark city streets outside, but it rapidly grew louder, sharper, and infinitely more urgent. It was not the steady siren of an ambulance responding to a medical emergency. It was the aggressive, overlapping, piercing wail of multiple police sirens converging on the Beaumont Hotel from every direction. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect against the high-arched windows of the grand ballroom. The authorities had arrived exactly on schedule because my legal team had officially submitted the complete embezzlement dossier to the federal authorities that very morning. The overlapping, piercing sirens outside the Beaumont Hotel cut through the thick, panicked air of the grand ballroom like a physical blade. The heavy, soundproofed walls of the lavish venue could no longer keep the harsh, unforgiving reality of the outside world at bay. Inside, the sheer volume of the angry crowd rapidly reached a fever pitch. The wealthiest, most prominent investors in the city abandoned all remaining pretenses of high society decorum. They surged forward in a synchronized, violent wave of furious betrayal, swarming the carpeted edge of the main stage. A few of the younger, more aggressive venture capitalists actually climbed directly onto the elevated platform, completely ignoring the decorative floral arrangements they viciously trampled beneath their expensive leather dress shoes. They cornered Brittany against the massive glowing screens that continued to endlessly broadcast the undeniable, damning proof of her extensive financial crimes to every single person in the room. Brittany frantically tried to scramble backward away from them, her shaking hands slipping repeatedly on the highly polished wood of the wide stage floor. She looked exactly like a trapped, terrified animal, her wide eyes darting wildly from side to side as the furious investors rapidly closed in around her, shouting aggressive demands for their vanished millions. She pressed her back tightly against the heavy metal base of the massive screens, curling her knees securely to her chest in a desperate, pathetic attempt to make herself physically smaller against the impending mob. Then the heavy gilded doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst wide open. They hit the adjacent marble walls with a resounding, explosive crash that briefly startled the angry, shouting mob into a sudden, hushed silence. A steady, highly intimidating stream of grim-faced men and women in dark windbreakers bearing the bold yellow letters of federal agencies marched directly into the room, tightly flanked by several heavily armed local uniformed police officers who stood by the entrances. The commanding, heavily armed presence of the federal authorities instantly shifted the chaotic, incredibly volatile energy of the massive crowded space. The aggressive shouting abruptly stopped, rapidly replaced by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching purposefully across the polished marble floor. The focused federal agents did not hesitate, pause, or even bother to look around at the lavish, glittering party decorations. They moved with absolute practiced precision, parting the large sea of wealthy guests and eager media reporters like a hot knife cutting through butter. The angry investors who had furiously swarmed the stage quickly stepped back, raising their hands defensively in the air and immediately clearing a wide, unobstructed path. Two lead federal agents, their professional expressions carved from solid stone, marched directly up the center steps of the main stage. They entirely ignored the frantic, rapid clicking of the press cameras and the blinding white flashes constantly illuminating their path. One tall, broad-shouldered agent walked straight toward Brittany, who was still cowering defensively on the floor. He did not bend down or offer her a polite, comforting hand up. He simply looked down at her ruined, tear-streaked face and loudly instructed her to stand immediately, stating clearly and firmly that she was officially being detained for immediate formal questioning regarding massive corporate fraud and grand embezzlement. Brittany immediately began to loudly and uncontrollably hyperventilate. She shook her head frantically from side to side, her heavy diamond chandelier earrings swinging violently as she desperately tried to scoot further away, crying out loudly to anyone who would listen that there was a massive, terrible mistake. The federal agent stepped forward without any hesitation, grabbed her trembling wrists, and pulled her arms firmly behind her back with practiced, ruthless efficiency. The sharp, metallic click of heavy handcuffs loudly echoed through the suddenly silent, observant room. As the cold steel locked securely around her wrists, the glamorous, completely untouchable facade she had spent years carefully building totally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. At the exact same time, two other stern, unyielding agents directly approached my father. David aggressively puffed out his broad chest, pathetically attempting to use his physical size and deep, booming voice to somehow intimidate the approaching officers. He stepped aggressively into the personal space of the second lead agent, his face flushing a furious, deep red as he loudly demanded to know exactly who was in charge and violently threatened to personally take every single one of their badges by the morning. The tall federal agent simply stared right back at him, entirely unbothered and thoroughly unimpressed by the pathetic, desperate public display of wealthy, arrogant entitlement. He calmly and loudly informed David that he was also being taken into federal custody, placing a heavy, unyielding hand directly on my father's tense shoulder. David forcefully tried to yank his arm away from their grip, shouting aggressively that he was a highly respected, prominent businessman, and that this entire spectacle was an illegal targeted harassment. But the two officers swiftly and forcefully shoved his hands firmly behind his back and instantly secured him in tight handcuffs. The lead agent immediately began loudly and clearly reciting their official Miranda rights, the solemn, devastating legal words bouncing clearly off the sparkling crystal chandeliers hanging high overhead. Down on the polished ballroom floor, silently watching her wealthy husband and her perfect golden child being brutally arrested in front of the entire city, Linda finally snapped. She watched the officers physically subdue David, the sheer crushing reality of their absolute ruin finally breaking completely through her deep, stubborn denial. She let out another ragged, breathless wail and violently broke away from the small, deeply shocked cluster of people she had been standing nervously near. She did not run toward the stage to furiously defend her husband or to comfort her weeping daughter. Instead, she turned rapidly on her heels and sprinted directly toward me. Her heavy emerald silk gown caught awkwardly on the thick carpet, but she simply stumbled forward, propelled entirely by pure, blind, selfish desperation. She reached me just as Ryan and I were turning toward the main exit. Linda threw herself forward, completely abandoning any remaining shred of social dignity or personal pride. She dropped heavily to her knees right in the middle of the ballroom floor, the expensive silk of her designer dress pooling uselessly around her shaking legs. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and grabbed tightly onto the hem of my long, dark wool coat. Her bony knuckles were stark white as she clung desperately to the thick, dark fabric. She looked frantically up at my face, her own face completely ruined by running makeup and heavy tears, her eyes wide with a terrifying, primal panic. "Please, Hannah," she screamed, her voice tearing painfully through her dry throat, echoing loudly in the massive space. "We are your family. We gave you life. You cannot let them do this. Where are we supposed to go?" The absolute pathetic, overwhelming desperation in her incredibly loud, shrieking voice hung extremely heavily in the thick, tense, charged air. She was actually looking up at me with pure, undeniable expectation, genuinely waiting for the daughter she had so viciously abused and heartlessly discarded to suddenly step in and magically save her from the devastating consequences of her own actions. I looked silently down at the weeping, utterly broken woman, desperately clinging to my long coat, feeling the very heavy, extremely suffocating weight of the last 18 years finally lifting completely from my shoulders.